They laughed when he cried, and they thought it was funny. That was the moment Julian realized love that humiliates is not love at all. It was supposed to be a celebration, a small dinner to honor something he'd built from the ground up. But in a single second, it turned into a memory he would never revisit, except to remind himself why he walked away. Julian was 27, a gay man living in Seattle, quiet, hardworking, disciplined. After years of sharing rentals with strangers, taking double shifts, skipping vacations, and setting aside every spare dollar, he had finally bought his first home. It wasn't enormous, but it was his. Every corner smelled like fresh paint and independence. The moment he held the keys, he stood in the empty living room and whispered, "I did it." And then he invited them, his parents, his older brother Marcus, his younger sister Ivy. Julian knew what they were like, always one joke away from cruelty, especially after he came out at 19. But somewhere inside, there was still a part of him that craved their approval. Maybe if they saw the house his house, they would see him differently. That evening, he lit candles and warmed dishes, careful to plate everything just right. When they arrived, they brought wine, laughter, and a cake that his mother had baked. For a while, it almost felt safe, but his father complimented the hardwood floors. Ivy took selfies on the stairs. Marcus joked about the neighborhood, but in a tone Julian could tolerate. After dinner, Julian served dessert, and his brother grinned. "We've got a special gift," Marcus said, pulling a thick envelope from his coat. "Thought it might come in handy." Julian smiled until he opened it. Inside was a letter that looked official. Legal header, case number. A notice that the home purchase had been voided due to a filing error. Julian's heart stopped. His breath hitched. He couldn't blink. His hands trembled as he read the words again. Was it possible? Had something gone wrong with escrow? He hadn't received any warning. And then came the sound. Laughter. Loud. Cruel. From every direction. Julian looked up. Marcus was recording him on his phone. Face smug, eyes gleaming. "You should have seen your face." He howled. "Man, you look like you lost everything." Ivy clapped her hands. Their father chuckled. His mother said nothing. Julian stood there, surrounded by the smell of food he had cooked, in the home he had bought with everything he had, being mocked for believing he might finally belong. He didn't say a word. He placed the fake letter on the table, turned toward the hallway, picked up the jacket he had hung carefully near the door, and walked outside. As he closed the door behind him, the laughter continued, muffled but sharp enough to pierce his chest. Julian didn't answer their calls that night, or the next day, or any day that followed. He didn't scream. He didn't fight back. He simply left the table they were all so proud to flip. That night, in the quiet of his new bedroom, he sat on the floor and wept. Not because they fooled him, but because they had never seen the weight behind his efforts. Not once, but in that silence, he realized something. Maybe this house wasn't a symbol of belonging to them. Maybe it was the beginning of belonging to himself. And sometimes healing starts not with forgiveness, but with a closed door. If this story feels like a reflection of something you've lived through, even just a part of it, you are not alone. At Heart Story, we tell stories that speak to the scars beneath the silence. If you've ever been called too sensitive for feeling pain, leave a dot in the comments so we know you were here. The next chapter begins with the truth, and Julian's is just getting started. The silence after the laughter didn't just fill the house. It echoed through Julian's memories like a haunting refrain. That night, the walk from the dinner table to the door had taken seconds. But the journey away from everything that moment represented had begun long before. It was just that this time, he didn't turn back. He didn't answer their calls, didn't open the messages. He blocked every number linked to that evening, one after another. For the first time, his boundaries weren't polite. They were solid. But pain doesn't end when people leave. It lingers in what they've planted. Julian found himself remembering other nights, other jokes, all brushed off in the name of family, humor. Like the time Marcus had cut the laces off Julian's only pair of dress shoes the morning of an internship interview, saying, Let's see you strut like that now. Or when Ivy had pretended their childhood dog had been hit by a car just to watch Julian's face crumble. Their mother had simply said, "They're just kids," and let it go. Even after coming out, when Julian sat his parents down, voice shaking but hopeful, their father had shrugged. "Don't make this your whole identity." The next week, they gifted him a Bible with highlighted verses. That was their way of saying, "This is who we want you to be." Through it all, the phrase never changed. "We're just joking. Don't be so sensitive." Julian had internalized it for years, smiled when it stung, laughed along when he wanted to disappear. He learned to make himself smaller at every family gathering, to avoid eye contact, to speak carefully, to always scan the room for when the next joke might land. But the dinner at his new home changed something. Not because the prank was the worst, it wasn't. It was because they hadn't been in control. He had built something for himself, something they didn't own, couldn't taint with backhanded remarks or side-eye comments. And their response was to tear it down with a fake letter and a camera. Julian deleted the voicemail his mother left, her voice thick with tears. "I don't know what happened. Why are you doing this to the family?" It wasn't a question, it was a weapon. A way to say you are the one breaking us, not the years of unspoken harm. The text from his aunt came next. "Your mom hasn't slept. Your siblings meant no harm. You're making this worse than it is." But Julian didn't reply. Instead, he stayed in his home, his quiet, sun-filled, echoing home. He painted a wall deep blue, just because he liked the color. He hung a photo of himself at 6 years old on the hallway wall, a photo where he was smiling wide, before he learned how to shrink. He lit candles in the evening and played old records that reminded him of the parts of himself untouched by their ridicule. And every day he healed in inches. He didn't feel angry anymore, just tired. But even in that exhaustion, there was clarity. The people who taught him to doubt his own hurt would never be the ones to honor his healing. Julian stopped asking for love in places that only gave him conditions. He learned that it was okay to be unreachable to those who only wanted access to his pain. And that family isn't sacred when used as a shield for cruelty. Sometimes, peace doesn't come from forgiveness or confrontation. It comes from the permission to walk away without guilt. From understanding that the silence you once feared might be the soil for your own voice to finally grow. And that voice, soft at first, can one day say, "I deserve better." I still do. Julian had chosen silence, but silence didn't protect him from being dragged back into the noise. At first, after the dinner, he thought they would eventually drift away offended, maybe, but too self-absorbed to pursue anything further. He assumed his absence would be punishment enough for them, or perhaps a relief. But Julian underestimated just how much some people hate losing control over the person they have always used as a punchline. It started with banging on his front door one Sunday afternoon. He had just returned from the farmer's market, arms full of fresh bread and tulips. He hadn't even set down the bags when he heard shouting from the porch. "Marcus?" And Ivy. "I know you're home," Marcus barked, pounding his fist against the door. "You gonna hide in there forever like a little coward?" Julian froze. The bag slipped from his arms, one of the tulip stems snapping under his foot. He didn't open the door. He didn't speak, but he watched through the peephole. Marcus was live streaming, his phone held high. Ivy stood beside him, smirking, reading comments out loud in a mocking tone. "They think you're pathetic," she said, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "And so do we." Julian backed away from the door. He turned off the lights and sat in the hallway, heartbeat thrumming against his ribs. Eventually, they left, but not without one final declaration shouted into the night. "You'll regret this. Family always finds its way back." He wanted to believe that was the end of it. He really did, but it wasn't. Days later, Julian walked outside to find his car splattered with eggs. The smell turned sour in the morning sun, yolk dripping down the windshield. At first, he thought it might have been kids, but then he saw its security footage from the door camera. Clear as daylight, Marcus and Ivy, laughing as they did it. They'd brought props, a GoPro, a ring light. It wasn't a moment of anger. It was planned, rehearsed, filmed like a segment for some personal reality show where cruelty passed as entertainment. Julian didn't hesitate this time. He walked straight to the police department and filed a harassment report. The officer listened, reviewed the footage, and issued a formal warning. A protective order was discussed. Julian declined for now, but the report was filed, stamped, and real. Marcus's reaction came within hours, a voicemail filled with rage. "You're a rat. Who calls the cops on their own family? You think this is what real men do?" But Julian didn't reply. He was done playing their game. If they wanted attention, they'd have to perform for someone else. Still, word spread. Extended relatives messaged him with passive-aggressive concerns. One cousin called it overreacting. An uncle hinted that Julian should grow thicker skin. He didn't respond to any of it. Instead, he planted lavender in his backyard, cleaned his windows, reorganized his pantry, and every night, before bed, he locked the doors not out of fear, but to protect the peace he'd earned. Because Julian had learned something powerful. People who mock your boundaries will always call you dramatic for enforcing them. They'll say you're selfish for putting up walls, but they'll never admit how often they tried to climb over them. In choosing to report the harassment, Julian hadn't abandoned his family. He'd simply stepped out of the roles they'd forced him to play. He was no longer the scared little brother who laughed off pain to be accepted. He was a man with a home, a name on a deed, and now a police report that said, "I will not be your victim." Sometimes we're taught that standing up to family is betrayal, but the real betrayal is convincing someone they have to endure cruelty to prove loyalty. Julian had nothing left to prove, and everything left to protect. Julian didn't want revenge. He didn't crave pity. What he wanted more than anything was to feel like his story mattered to someone, to know that he wasn't crazy for walking away, that what had happened at that dinner table wasn't just a joke, but a kind of violence that left no bruises, only cracks in identity. It was a friend from work, someone who'd seen Julian shrink away from birthday celebrations and dodge questions about his family, who gently said over coffee one afternoon, "You should talk about it. Not for them, for you, and for the people who don't know how to put it into words." Julian didn't answer right away. He wasn't an influencer. He wasn't even particularly active online. But that night, sitting in his bedroom, his heart still knotted from the latest round of voicemails and the sharp silence that followed. He opened his laptop. He didn't script anything. He didn't try to sound poetic or polished. He simply uploaded a short video, just his voice narrating over a timeline of screenshots, security camera footage, and a single photo of him at that dinner, holding the envelope in trembling hands. There was no yelling, no dramatics, just truth. He ended the clip with a line that had echoed inside him for weeks. "They laughed when I cried, and I finally stopped apologizing for leaving." He closed the laptop and went to bed. By morning, everything had changed. Notifications poured in, first a few dozen, then thousands. Within 2 days, the video crossed the million mark. Then 2, then 3. Comment after comment echoed the same thing. "This happened to me too. I thought I was alone. You said what I've never had the words for." Strangers stitched together solidarity in the threads below his post. Some shared stories of being mocked for their trauma. Others admitted they hadn't spoken to their parents in years and finally felt seen. The messages weren't shallow sympathy. They were collective exhalations of people who had carried similar wounds in silence. Julian read them slowly, carefully, sometimes with tears, sometimes with a strange, quiet smile. For the first time, his pain wasn't being questioned, it was being witnessed. 3 days after the video went viral, he received an email from a national LGBTQ+ rights organization. They had launched a campaign called Family Shouldn't Hurt, an initiative aiming to spotlight stories like his. They asked if Julian would be willing to speak not as a headline, but as a voice for others who were still stuck at tables that made them feel small. He hesitated, but only for a moment, not because he wanted to be famous, but because he remembered what it felt like to be coming out in a living room full of judgment. He remembered what it felt like to doubt his worth every time he chose himself. And if his voice could help even one person feel less alone, maybe the pain hadn't been in vain. Julian agreed to participate in a short interview. Nothing flashy, just him, sitting in a sunlit room, talking about boundaries, healing, and how sometimes the most radical act of self-love is walking away from the people who refuse to grow. What he didn't expect was the ripple effect. Other people began sharing their stories. Videos appeared with captions like "inspired by Julian's post," featuring broken birthday cakes, unopened letters, and decades of silence finally being named for what it was: survival. Some responses were angry. Predictably, a few distant relatives called it airing dirty laundry. But Julian didn't flinch. Because when you've been humiliated in private for years, telling your truth out loud isn't betrayal, it's reclamation. He didn't watch his video again. He didn't need to. The version of him who cried at that dinner no longer needed defending. He had already been seen fully, clearly, and without apology. And in that exposure, something unexpected had bloomed, not shame, but freedom. Because when you stop hiding your pain, you make space for others to begin healing theirs. The world had seen what his family chose to ignore. And that should have been the ending, but healing rarely wraps itself up in neat, satisfying bows. It shows up in quieter moments, in the rituals of an ordinary life, when no one is watching and the applause has faded. Julian didn't chase headlines. After the campaign, he politely declined every press interview. He wasn't interested in becoming a symbol or a brand. He just wanted to live in the peace he had carved out for himself, room by room, in a house they once tried to take from him with a lie. The tulips had bloomed again in the front yard, right under the window where ivy had once laughed into a live stream. The same spot now bathed in morning light, unbothered by the past. Inside, Julian's routine became gentle. He woke early, brewed coffee, opened the curtains, and let silence stretch across the hardwood floor like a welcome guest. For the first time, his days weren't about surviving someone else's mood. Then, one afternoon, as he was wiping down the front window, he noticed something on the porch. A letter. There was no knock, no ring, just a white envelope slipped beneath the welcome mat. His heart stalled for a second. He knew the handwriting, his mother's. He stared at it, unsure whether to touch it at all. Eventually, he picked it up and carried it inside, not with fear, but with a steady, practiced calm. He opened it with the care of someone examining an old wound. Inside, only a single sentence was written in looping. Deliberate ink. You are the shame of this family. No apology, no reflection, no change. Just one last attempt to pull him back into the story they had written for him, one where his existence was still something to fix, not something to honor. Julian didn't cry. He didn't tremble. He walked to the kitchen sink, turned on the burner, and watched as the letter curled to ash in a shallow metal bowl. The flames danced, and with them, something inside him released. He wasn't angry anymore. He was simply done. He returned to his laptop, still warm from the afternoon's writing session. The screen glowed with an open document, a draft of his first long-form story titled, "Healing Starts at Your Own Doorstep." He smiled as he typed the next sentence, not for the internet this time, but for himself. That evening, Julian stood in his living room, a cup of mint tea warming his hand. The sunset painted the walls in shades of amber and gold. A soft playlist hummed in the background. There were no voices mocking him, no footsteps stomping in with Kate, just quiet, a kind of freedom most people mistake for loneliness. But Julian knew the truth. This stillness was not absence. It was presence, the full weight of being, finally without permission. News spread that Marcus and Ivy had lost their jobs. Their employers cited harassment behavior that violated ethical standards. Julian hadn't shared the video with their companies. He didn't need to. The internet did what it always does. It amplified the truth. He didn't gloat. He didn't respond. The punishment wasn't the point. The point was his life had moved on, and theirs, still stuck in ridicule and ego, would never reach the peace he had found. Julian's house was still modest, the walls were still thin, but they echoed now with something stronger than fear, self-respect, because the house they mocked had become his sanctuary, and the boy they laughed at had become a man who no longer lived to be palatable. Some people spend years waiting for their family to change before allowing themselves to be whole. But Julian learned that you don't need closure to begin. You only need the courage to close the door and mean it. Now, we ask you this. Have you ever had to walk away from someone you loved in order to finally love yourself? Tell us, even with just a single word below. And don't forget to subscribe to Heart Story, where we tell the stories that hurt and the ones that heal.